What if the past is not a chain of dates, but a series of breaths interrupted? What if entire civilizations did not simply fade, but stumbled when something invisible entered the room and changed the meaning of tomorrow? History often speaks in grand, polished terms. Empires rise, kingdoms fall, trade expands, power shifts. The language is orderly, almost serene. But underneath those calm summaries are ordinary bodies, a child shivering beneath linen, a ruler too weak to stand, a laborer pausing at dawn because the ache behind the eyes feels strangely new. Long before satellites, laboratories, or modern medicine, people lived at the mercy of forces they could not name, and among the most devastating was disease. This story begins there, in that fragile space between knowledge and fear, not with a single plague, but with a question that echoes across centuries. How many turning points in human history were shaped not by kings or armies, but by fever? How many cities lost their future because something microscopic moved through a harbor, a marketplace, a caravan route, or a cup of water? Again and again, the pattern appears. Civilization grows confident, roads lengthen, ships multiply, wealth gathers, ideas travel farther than ever before. And then, through the same channels that carried grain, silk, faith, and ambition, something else begins to move, something silent, something patient. A sickness arrives not in isolation, but at the height of connection. That is the haunting paradox at the center of this journey. The systems that made the ancient world brilliant also made it vulnerable. The greater the network, the wider the wound. Beneath the marble, the gold, the monuments, and the myths, there were always lungs filling with infection, hands burning with heat, families waiting through the night for a dawn that did not heal. So before we speak of collapse, we have to speak of closeness, of trade, of crowded streets, of shared wells and open ports, of the fragile human body meeting an unseen visitor. Because sometimes the end of an age begins so quietly that no one notices it at first. Just a fever, just a cough, just one morning that seemed for a moment like any other. It began, as many historical mysteries do, at the edge of water. In the second millennium BCE, along the Nile and across the trading worlds of the ancient Near East, life depended on movement. Barges carried grain. Caravans crossed dry horizons. Merchant ships stitched distant ports together with cedar, copper, incense, and rumor. Civilization was learning how to connect itself, and with connection came a new kind of vulnerability. One of the earliest pandemics known to history may have moved through this world almost without a name. We do not have hospital charts or laboratory proof. What we have are fragments, mummies marked by lesions, ancient texts that hint at widespread suffering, and the quiet testimony of bones. Smallpox is often placed among the earliest great suspects. Its story reaches so far back that history and medicine begin to blur into one another. Imagine an Egyptian settlement at dusk. The air still carries the heat of the day. A woman notices a child's fever, then a rash, then the terrible realization that others nearby are falling ill in the same way. Priests offer prayers. Families isolate as best they can. But in a world where homes pressed close and trade never truly stopped, containment was more hope than strategy. Illness moved through households the way river water found its path. Naturally, relentlessly, without asking permission. What makes these early outbreaks so haunting is not only their scale, but their silence. Ancient societies could observe patterns, but they could not see the cause. They recognized contagion in the language available to them: impurity, curse, imbalance, divine warning. Yet even without microscopes, they understood the emotional truth of epidemic disease. It separated the living from the familiar world. It made neighbors fearful of touch and turned the body itself into a source of uncertainty. And still, life continued. Fields had to be harvested. Temples had to be maintained. Trade resumed because survival required it. That tension feels strangely modern. The need to keep moving while something dangerous moves with you. Perhaps that is why the earliest pandemics matter so deeply. They remind us that human beings have always lived in negotiation with the unseen. We build roads to one another, and those roads bring beauty, wealth, and knowledge. But every bridge also carries risk. In the ancient world, that lesson arrived not as theory, but as fever written onto skin, into memory, and across the first great networks of civilization. What happens when an empire powerful enough to command armies cannot command its own fate? In the 14th century BCE, the Hittite Empire stood as one of the great powers of the ancient world, stretching across Anatolia and into the tense diplomatic landscape of the Near East. Its kings negotiated with Egypt, fought over borders, and ruled from fortified cities built to project order. Yet somewhere in that machinery of strength, something invisible entered and began to undo it from within. The story is often called the Plague of the Hittites, though even now its exact nature remains uncertain. Some historians have suggested tularemia, others point to different infectious diseases. The name matters less than the pattern it left behind. Soldiers returning from campaign, disease spreading through the population, and a long season of death that seemed to linger year after year. In royal prayers and records, we hear not certainty, but bewilderment. There is something deeply human in those surviving voices. A king does not speak like a monument. He speaks like a grieving man, trying to make sense of disaster. He asks, what offense has been committed? What god has been angered? What hidden wrong has opened the door to suffering? This is one of history's oldest reflexes. When the cause is unseen, the mind searches for meaning. Not because ancient people were naive, but because grief always demands a story. Picture the capital at Hattusa under a pale sky. Messengers arrive with bad news from the frontier. In the inner chambers, officials whisper the names of the dead. A ruler who should be planning treaties and defenses now faces a more intimate enemy. Weakness in the limbs, fever in the palace, absence in the places where trusted voices once stood. Administration slows, succession grows unstable, fear enters the political bloodstream. That is the cruel architecture of epidemic disease. It does not only kill individuals, it erodes confidence, interrupts decision-making, and turns uncertainty into a governing force. The Hittite state was not destroyed in a single dramatic moment by plague alone. History is rarely that simple, but illness deepened every existing fracture. It made a strained world more fragile. And maybe that is the deeper lesson hidden in these old royal laments. Power can defend borders, but it cannot always protect intimacy. It cannot stop the trembling hand, the empty bed, the silence at council. The strongest empires often imagine that collapse arrives from outside. Yet sometimes it begins in the most private places, where breath shortens, bodies fail, and history changes before anyone has the language to explain why. What if the sickness did not stop at one kingdom, but moved with the rhythm of an entire interconnected age? By the late Bronze Age, the Eastern Mediterranean had become a living web. Palaces exchanged gifts like signals of trust. Ships crossed from Cyprus to the Levant. Tin and copper, grain and pottery, letters and envoys all passed through the same narrow corridors of sea and land. It was a brilliant world, and a precarious one. Somewhere inside that brilliance, disease appears again, hard to classify, impossible to ignore. The archives from places like Ugarit and neighboring kingdoms offer glimpses of instability, interruption, and strain. Not all of it was caused by illness, of course. Drought, war, migration, and political rivalry pressed in from every side. But epidemic disease may have been one of the quiet accelerants, moving beneath the surface while the larger crisis took shape above it. Imagine a port city at first light. Warehouses open, sailors unload cargo, scribes record inventories with practiced hands. The harbor smells of salt, cedar, and damp rope. Yet in the alleys behind the market, a different ledger is forming. Fever. In one household, then another, then among laborers who load the grain, then among those who guard it. The city continues to function, but each day requires more effort than the last. Beneath the outward motion, something is thinning. That is often how collapse begins, not as a single blow, but as a loss of resilience. A civilization can survive one bad harvest, one military defeat, one damaged road. But when multiple pressures converge, even a sophisticated system can begin to fail in ways that feel strangely intimate. A missing crew, a delayed shipment, a ruler too ill to decide, a ritual left unfinished. At first, these seem like fragments. Then they become the texture of an age coming apart. The late Bronze Age collapse remains one of history's great puzzles because it resists simple answers. That may be precisely the point. Human societies rarely fall for one reason alone. They unravel when stress meets vulnerability, when complexity becomes brittle, when the ordinary bonds that hold daily life together weaken all at once. And disease, though often invisible in the grand narrative, may have been one of those hidden pressures, moving through ports and palaces alike, reminding us that connection is both civilization's greatest gift and its oldest risk. The more tightly a world is woven, the more widely a single tear can travel. How does a civilization respond when the gods seem silent and the dead become too many to count? In the 5th century BCE, Athens was supposed to be entering its moment of greatness. It had built a dazzling democratic experiment, filled its city with argument and ambition, and stood at the center of an intellectual world still shaping our own. Then, in the early years of the Peloponnesian War, another force entered the city, one with no allegiance, no banner, and no mercy. The Athenian Plague arrived in a moment of terrible crowding. As Sparta threatened the countryside, people flooded behind the long walls for safety. The city became a vessel filled beyond its limits. Wells, streets, and homes strained under the weight of so many bodies pressed together in fear. And then the illness began. We still debate what it was. Typhus, typhoid, smallpox, measles, perhaps something now lost to certainty. But the descriptions left behind remain among the most haunting in ancient literature. The historian Thucydides survived it, and because he did, the plague still breathes through his words. He wrote not as a distant moralist, but as a witness. He saw the fevers, the thirst, the exhaustion, the speed with which the healthy became unrecognizable. He saw social order begin to loosen as grief outpaced custom. Rituals frayed, burial practices collapsed under the sheer pressure of loss. Even language itself seemed smaller than what was happening. Picture Athens at midday, its stone surfaces glowing in the heat. Somewhere in a narrow house, someone calls for water. Somewhere else, a family debates whether to stay near the sick or flee. At the edge of the agora, rumor moves as fast as infection. No one knows who will be taken next. The city that once trusted in reason and debate now confronts a more primal uncertainty. Not what is just, but what can survive. And yet the deepest wound may not have been physical alone. The plague altered the emotional architecture of the polis. It taught Athenians that brilliance does not grant immunity, that culture, art, philosophy, and political confidence can all be humbled by the body's fragility. Their world did not end in a single season, but something essential shifted. The city continued, but under a shadow it could not fully explain. Perhaps that is why the Athenian plague still feels close to us. It reveals how quickly a society's ideals can be tested when suffering becomes collective, and it leaves behind a question that never quite ages. When fear moves through a community faster than certainty, what remains of who we thought we were? What does war protect if the enemy is already inside the gates? After Athens, the lesson did not vanish. It traveled forward into another age, another empire, another vast experiment in order. By the 2nd century CE, Rome seemed to have mastered scale itself. Roads crossed continents, legions held borders, markets, laws, and languages moved through an imperial system so extensive it could feel almost eternal. And then the Antonine Plague entered that system like a whisper that would not stop. It likely arrived with soldiers returning from campaigns in the east. As with so many ancient diseases, certainty remains elusive. Many scholars suspect smallpox, while others have argued for measles. But the human outline of the catastrophe is unmistakable. The disease spread across the empire in waves, reaching crowded cities, military encampments, and distant provinces. What Rome had built for strength, mobility, density, connection, became the perfect medium for transmission. Imagine a Roman road under cold morning light. A column of troops advances toward home, shields dull with dust, pack animals trailing behind. They carry victory stories, injuries, supplies, and something else no one can see. Weeks later, in a town far from the front, people begin to fall ill. A merchant misses market day. A child develops a fever. A physician, trained in reason yet limited by the knowledge of the age, watches symptoms multiply faster than explanation. News does not arrive all at once. It accumulates village by village, household by household, until the pattern becomes impossible to deny. Even emperors were not beyond its reach. Marcus Aurelius, the philosopher-emperor so often remembered for meditations on discipline and mortality, ruled through this period of immense strain. There is a painful symmetry in that. A man devoted to inner steadiness confronted a world where death moved unpredictably, beyond philosophy, beyond law, beyond military force. The empire endured, but endurance came at a cost. Manpower thinned, trade faltered, trust weakened, and the emotional confidence of Rome was quietly altered. Pandemics do not only empty cities, they change the tempo of civilization. They make every absence visible. A missing laborer affects a harvest. A weakened garrison affects a frontier. A grieving household affects the texture of a neighborhood. Multiply that across an empire, and disease becomes more than a medical event. It becomes a historical climate. Perhaps that is what the Antonine Plague teaches most clearly. Rome did not collapse in that moment, but it was reminded, perhaps for the first time on such a scale, that greatness is not the same as invulnerability. A civilization can command roads, armies, and stone, yet still be brought into intimate negotiation with breath, fever, and loss. The larger the empire, the more rooms there are for silence to gather. What happens to a world already under strain when illness returns before memory has healed? In the 3rd century CE, the Roman Empire was no longer standing in the clear confidence of its earlier age. Borders were pressured, leadership turned unstable, economies faltered, armies proclaimed and discarded emperors with startling speed. It was a time when the empire still looked immense on a map, yet felt unsettled from within. Then came another wave of disease, remembered now as the Plague of Cyprian. Its name comes from Cyprian, the bishop of Carthage, whose writings preserved the emotional landscape of the outbreak. He described symptoms in harrowing detail: relentless weakness, stomach illness, damaged limbs, failing eyes, bodies losing their strength in ways that felt both intimate and apocalyptic. We still do not know exactly what disease it was. Some possibilities include viral hemorrhagic fever, smallpox, measles, or another epidemic illness now impossible to identify with confidence. But uncertainty about the diagnosis does not lessen the force of the human experience it left behind. Picture Carthage at dawn. The harbor is awake, but not fully alive. Ships still arrive, traders still bargain. Somewhere, a baker opens his stall, yet there is hesitation in the air, a subtle withdrawal. People watch one another more carefully. Sounds that once signaled routine now carry another meaning. A cough from the next room, hurried footsteps at night, a cart passing too often toward the burial grounds. The city is functioning, but like a body moving through exhaustion. Cyprian's account matters not only because it records suffering, but because it reveals how disease can change moral perception. Epidemics force communities to confront one another in new ways. Who is cared for? Who is abandoned? Which duties survive fear and which collapse beneath it? In moments like these, belief becomes less abstract. Philosophy, religion, and civic values are all tested against the same difficult fact. Someone must decide whether to remain beside the sick. The plague moved through a Rome already shaken by military conflict and political fragmentation. That is what made it historically powerful. Disease did not create every crisis of the 3rd century, but it intensified a civilization's fatigue. It deepened labor shortages, disturbed agriculture, strained the military, and darkened the mood of an empire that had begun to suspect its own limits. And maybe that is the hidden shape of many historical turning points. They are not always loud at first. Sometimes an age changes because a society that is already tired becomes just a little more tired, just a little more afraid, just a little less certain it can recover. The question is never only how many died. It is also what kind of future becomes harder to imagine when illness teaches a civilization to doubt its own strength. What if the most devastating pandemics were not only episodes of death, but moments when the world itself seemed to lose coherence? In the 6th century CE, the Mediterranean was still haunted by Rome's memory. Emperor Justinian, ruling from Constantinople, dreamed of restoring imperial greatness, recovering lost territories, codifying law, binding together a fractured inheritance. It was an age of ambition, architecture, and belief. And then, from the edges of trade and grain supply, another ancient terror emerged, the plague now associated with his name. Many historians identify it as an early outbreak of bubonic plague, caused by the bacterium Yersinia pestis. It likely traveled through commercial networks, linking Africa, Asia, and the Mediterranean, moving alongside cargo, animals, and the restless motion of empire. The exact paths remain debated, but the broad truth is chillingly familiar. The same routes that nourished cities also exposed them. Grain ships fed Constantinople. They may also have carried the conditions for catastrophe. Imagine the imperial capital under a grey spring sky. The harbours are crowded. Warehouses hum with activity. In the markets, voices rise in different languages, and the city seems to embody the confidence of a world gathered into one place. Then reports begin to spread. First in murmurs, then in fear. People develop sudden fever. Pain follows. Swellings appear. Homes are marked by absence almost overnight. Soon, the city is not merely busy, but overwhelmed. The machinery of governance, commerce, burial, and prayer all begin to strain at once. Chroniclers describe bodies accumulating faster than systems could respond. Labor vanished where it was most needed. Public life narrowed. Even power itself seemed to grow frail. Justinian's empire did not disappear in a single sweep because of plague alone, but the outbreak altered the horizon of what was possible. Military campaigns slowed. Revenues fell. Recovery became uneven and uncertain. A vision of restoration met the blunt fact of human vulnerability. There is something especially haunting about plague in a city built on order. It reveals how thin the line can be between magnificence and fragility. A capital may glitter with domes, laws, and ceremony, yet still depend on the ordinary continuity of workers, sailors, farmers, caregivers, and gravediggers. When enough of those lives are interrupted, grandeur becomes strangely weightless. Perhaps that is why the Plague of Justinian echoes so strongly through history. It is not only a story about disease, it is a story about scale, interdependence, and the limits of imperial imagination. We plan for greatness as though tomorrow will cooperate. But pandemics remind us that history is also shaped by what we cannot see, cannot fully control, and too often do not notice until the pattern is already everywhere. How many times can a society endure the return of the same shadow before it begins to imagine history itself as fragile? After the first shock of Justinian's plague, the disease did not simply vanish into the past. It returned in waves, sometimes years apart, sometimes closer, revisiting towns, ports, and agricultural heartlands across the Mediterranean and beyond. For many communities, plague was no longer an isolated disaster. It became part of the atmosphere of life. This is one of the hardest things to grasp from a distance. We often think of pandemics as single events with clear beginnings and endings. But for those living through recurrent outbreaks, the experience was different. Imagine rebuilding a household, reopening a workshop, planting fields again, marrying, giving thanks for survival, and then hearing that the sickness has appeared in another harbor. The future narrows. Hope does not disappear, but it becomes more cautious. Recovery learns to walk with memory. Picture a coastal town at sunset. Fishing boats return. Children run between stone walls. In the square, an old man notices how quickly rumor changes the light in people's faces. Someone heard that a nearby city has buried hundreds. Someone else says traders have stopped arriving. Suddenly, every ordinary gesture feels exposed. A handshake is reconsidered. A crowded room becomes a question. The body, once taken for granted, becomes a site of attention and dread. Repeated outbreaks do more than reduce population. They reshape the emotional habits of a civilization. Families alter how they mourn. Communities adjust trade, movement, and ritual. Political leaders must govern not only through material losses, but through fatigue. Even faith changes tone. Prayers are not only for rescue, but for endurance, for the strength to continue in a world where uncertainty keeps returning with familiar footsteps. Historians still debate exactly how much these recurring plagues contributed to long-term transformations in the Byzantine world and neighboring regions. Disease was never the sole author of history. Climate, warfare, taxation, migration, and internal conflict all mattered deeply. But recurring epidemic disease may have acted like a steady pressure on an already burdened structure, limiting recovery, weakening confidence, and making resilience more difficult to sustain. Maybe that is the quiet truth hidden inside these cycles. The deepest damage of a pandemic is not always the first wave of death. Sometimes it is the afterlife of fear, the altered sense of time, the knowledge that normal life can resume and still remain conditional. When illness returns often enough, it changes not only what a people can build, but what they can believe about tomorrow. What if the most feared disease in one civilization was not the one that killed fastest, but the one that stayed longest? Long before modern medicine understood bacteria or immunity, another illness carved its way through the ancient world with a slower, more intimate cruelty. It did not always arrive like a single dramatic wave. Often, it lingered. It marked bodies. It isolated people while leaving them alive enough to be seen, judged, and remembered. This was leprosy, or what ancient societies often understood as a family of disfiguring skin diseases gathered beneath one name. Across India, the Near East, Egypt, and later the Mediterranean world, leprosy occupied a different emotional space from the explosive plagues. It was feared not only for pain, but for duration. A fever can terrify a city for a season. A chronic disease can alter the moral texture of everyday life for generations. Ancient texts, legal codes, and religious traditions all reveal how deeply societies struggled to interpret visible illness. The afflicted were not only patients. Too often they became symbols onto which communities projected anxiety, impurity, and dread. Imagine a road outside an ancient town in the late afternoon. Dust rises in the light. A man walks alone, not because solitude is his nature, but because others have learned to step back when they see the changes in his skin. He is still alive, still conscious, still carrying memory, yet he moves through the world as though separated by an invisible wall. Disease here is not only biological, it becomes social. It reorganizes distance. That may be the most haunting part of leprosy's long history. It exposed a painful truth about human communities. We do not fear suffering only when it threatens death. We also fear what unsettles the boundary between the familiar and the unfamiliar. A body altered over time can provoke something deeper than panic. It can provoke judgment, and judgment can wound as deeply as infection. Of course, ancient people were not uniquely cruel. They were responding with the knowledge and fears available to them, just as all societies do in different forms. Some traditions created rituals of exclusion. Others created forms of care, shelter, and recognition. The record is mixed because humanity is mixed. Compassion and fear have always lived side by side. So leprosy belongs in this story, not because it toppled empires overnight, but because it reveals another face of epidemic history. Not every civilization is tested only by mass death. Sometimes it is tested by how it sees those who remain, marked, vulnerable, and asking whether survival without belonging is another kind of loss. And that question, quiet as it is, may be one of the oldest questions history leaves behind. What if a disease could travel quietly through beauty itself, through touch, intimacy, birth, and the hope of a future family. In the ancient world, not every devastating illness announced itself with crowded burials or sudden collapse. Some moved more subtly, threading through private lives and leaving damage that was harder to count. Among the most debated of these is syphilis, or at least diseases resembling it, whose early history remains deeply contested among scholars. The argument is not simple. For generations, historians and scientists have asked whether syphilis was unknown in the Old World before the late 15th century, or whether related treponemal diseases existed much earlier in forms that were later misunderstood, renamed, or absorbed into broader descriptions of illness. Skeletal evidence, historical texts, and medical interpretation do not line up neatly, and perhaps that uncertainty matters as much as the answer. It reminds us that the past does not always reveal its wounds clearly. Imagine an ancient settlement where no one would name the disease the way we do now. There is no fixed diagnosis, no agreed vocabulary. There are only consequences: unexplained sores, chronic pain, pregnancies ending in grief, infants weakened from the beginning, relationships strained by suspicion and silence. The suffering exists, whether the label does or not. History is full of illnesses that shaped lives long before they were understood well enough to be classified. What makes sexually transmitted disease so powerful in any era is that it enters the most intimate parts of human experience. It touches desire, loyalty, shame, tenderness, inheritance, and the fragile hope people place in one another. Epidemic illness in a marketplace can frighten a city. Illness bound to the private body can transform how a culture thinks about trust itself. Ancient societies often interpreted such suffering through moral, spiritual, or ritual frameworks. That did not make them uniquely judgmental, it made them human. When pain is difficult to trace, people look for meaning in behavior, in fate, in hidden transgression. Yet those explanations can become another burden carried by the sick. The body suffers first. The story imposed on that body may wound next. So this chapter belongs less to certainty than to possibility. Whether syphilis, as we define it, existed in the ancient world, or whether related diseases occupied that historical space, the larger truth remains. Civilization is not only tested by the illnesses that fill public squares with fear, it is also tested by the illnesses that move in silence through the chambers of love, birth, and secrecy. And maybe that leaves us with one of history's gentlest but hardest reflections. Some of the deepest epidemics do not only threaten life, they alter intimacy. They teach people to fear closeness even as they long for it. And when that happens, the distance between bodies becomes more than physical. It becomes part of how a culture remembers what it means to be human. What if the deadliest diseases were not always the most visible, but the ones woven into ordinary survival? In many ancient civilizations, the great destroyers were not only dramatic plagues recorded by historians and emperors, they were also the illnesses carried in water, in insects, in the daily conditions of crowded life. Dysentery, cholera-like gastrointestinal disease, malaria, and other endemic infections did not always arrive as singular historical events. Often they remained season after season, turning vulnerability into a permanent feature of existence. Imagine a river valley at the height of summer. The land is generous. Crops rise. Children run barefoot through warm dust. Water glints in clay jars and irrigation channels, promising life. Yet somewhere in that same water, danger waits. A single contaminated source can pass quietly through a household. A single mosquito-filled marsh can thin a population one fever at a time. These are not cinematic catastrophes in the usual sense. They are slower, more repetitive, and in some ways more intimate because they become part of the structure of ordinary days. This is one of history's most sobering truths. Civilizations were often built in places that nourished both people and disease. River systems made agriculture possible, but they also gathered waste and contamination. Dense settlements made trade and culture flourish, but they intensified exposure. Expansion into fertile lowlands brought food, wealth, and strategic advantage, while also inviting illnesses that preyed on proximity, heat, and standing water. The geography of success was often also the geography of fragility. Malaria, in particular, may have shaped more history than many dramatic battles. In parts of Greece, Rome, Egypt, India, and beyond, recurring fevers could drain labor, weaken armies, end pregnancies, and turn whole regions into places where strength was harder to sustain. Dysentery and waterborne disease could move through military camps and urban populations with devastating efficiency. These illnesses rarely needed grand entrances. They simply waited for poor sanitation, crowding, exhaustion, or climate to give them room. And because they were common, they could become strangely invisible in historical memory. Chronic suffering often leaves fewer monuments than sudden disaster. Yet the effect is profound. A society burdened by constant disease lives differently. It plans differently. It fears different seasons. It treats childhood, travel, labor, and old age through the lens of uncertainty. The body is never entirely separate from the environment around it. Perhaps that is the reflection this chapter asks us to hold. The ancient world was not only threatened by rare moments of collapse, but by the steady pressure of illness embedded in everyday life. Sometimes civilizations are not broken by one extraordinary blow. Sometimes they are slowly worn down by the quiet cost of staying alive. And in that long negotiation between land, water, body, and time, we begin to see history not as a march of certainty, but as a fragile conversation with the natural world itself. What if the true story of ancient pandemics is not about which disease was worst, but about what disease revealed? By the time we step back from these scattered centuries, from Egypt to Athens, from Hattusa to Rome, from Constantinople to the river valleys that sustained daily life, a larger pattern begins to emerge. Epidemics did not visit history from outside it. They were woven into the same systems that made civilization possible: trade, settlement, ambition, mobility, intimacy, and faith in tomorrow. That is why these stories feel larger than medicine alone. A pandemic is never just a biological event. It is a mirror held up to a society at the moment when certainty begins to crack. It shows who has access to safety and who does not. It reveals which institutions are resilient and which depend on illusions of control. It alters not only population counts, but language, ritual, labor, politics, and the moral imagination of a people. Even when cities survive, they do not emerge unchanged. Imagine standing on the ruins of an ancient street at dusk. The columns are broken. Grass moves where crowds once passed. Somewhere beneath the soil are the traces of kitchens, workshops, prayers, and the private grief of families who never imagined they would become archaeology. It is tempting to think of them as distant from us, enclosed in another world. But in the face of disease, their questions sound remarkably familiar. What is happening? Who is safe? What do we owe one another now? How do we continue when normal life has become unreliable? Again and again, the ancient world answered imperfectly just as we do. Some communities turned to exclusion, others turned to care. Some sought explanation in gods, some in observation, some in custom, some in fear. None possessed complete understanding, yet all were trying to live through uncertainty with the tools they had. There is dignity in that, even when the record is painful. So perhaps the meaning of these ancient pandemics lies here. They remind us that history is not made only by visionaries, conquerors, and monuments. It is also made by bodies, vulnerable, interconnected, exposed. The invisible has always shaped the visible. The microscopic has always negotiated with the monumental. And as this journey approaches its end, one quiet insight remains. Civilizations are remembered for what they build, but they are tested by how they endure fragility. In that sense, every ancient outbreak leaves behind more than tragedy. It leaves behind a question still waiting for us. When the structures around us begin to tremble, what kind of humanity do we choose to preserve? In the end, the story of ancient pandemics is not simply a catalogue of suffering. It is a meditation on what it means to live in a world where certainty has always been partial, where the forces that shape history are often too small to see and too powerful to ignore. We began with the image of interrupted breath, of civilizations brought to a pause by something invisible. We end with a deeper realization. Those interruptions did not stand outside human history. They were part of it, woven into the same fabric as trade, migration, empire, ritual, family, and hope. Across centuries, the pattern returns with haunting consistency. A society expands, roads lengthen, ports flourish, cities gather strangers into community, knowledge grows, wealth accumulates. People begin to feel that they understand the structure of their world. Then disease enters through the very channels that made that world possible. Not as a moral punishment, not as a simple fable, but as a reminder that progress and vulnerability often travel together. The more connected a civilization becomes, the more deeply it depends on fragile balances it cannot fully control. And yet these stories are not only about collapse, they are also about response. Again and again, human beings cared for one another with incomplete knowledge. They prayed, observed, adapted, mourned, buried, rebuilt, and tried to speak meaning into fear. They were not always compassionate. They were not always wise. But neither are we. Their record feels familiar precisely because it captures the full range of human reaction. Courage beside panic, tenderness beside exclusion, endurance beside despair. Maybe that is why the ancient world still matters so much. Its epidemics remind us that history is not a distant theater of finished events. It is a long conversation about fragility. The ruins we inherit were once filled with people who loved their families, trusted tomorrow, and believed their world would continue in recognizable form. Then something changed. It always can. So the final question is not whether humanity can escape uncertainty. No civilization ever has. The deeper question is what we do with that knowledge. Do we become harder, narrower, more fearful? Or do we learn that our vulnerability is shared and that memory itself can become a form of care? Perhaps that is the oldest lesson these lost ages offer us. The future has never belonged to the strongest alone. It belongs again and again to those who remember that survival is human only when it leaves room for compassion.